On our first Beowulf video, we primarily covered the story of Beowulf's fight against the monster Grendel. And at the end of that video, we remember that Grendel's mother also attacked Hall-Heorot to try to get the arm from her son back. So by using her powers, she hoped to resurrect her son. Well, since she's now a new threat, Beowulf has decided that it's up to him to go against Grendel's mother. Well, the king, Hrothgar, and Queen Wealhtheow begged Beowulf not to go because, as Queen Wealhtheow had said, she is 10 times more terrible than her son. However, Beowulf, being Beowulf, was determined to go. But this time, after hearing all those stories, he decided he would arm himself. He had his sword with him, he had a helmet, and he had a breastplate. But before Beowulf and his men went to that swampy land where Grendel and Grendel's mother lived, Unferth, the man who had challenged Beowulf, came forward with his own sword and said, "Beowulf, I'm sorry I challenged you. You showed what you could do. This is my ancestral sword. Please carry it with you into battle against Grendel's mother." And Beowulf understood the honor of that request and that Unferth was trying to make up for his past misgivings. And Beowulf gratefully accepted the sword and said he would take it with him. Beowulf and his men were told where the old swamp was, but they didn't even have to be told. Not long after they left King Hrothgar's court, they could smell their way to that horrible swamp. And when they got there, it was green and it was bubbling like it was boiling. Red veins where creatures had been killed were floating to the surface, red veins of blood. It was the most disgusting thing Beowulf's men had ever seen. And they begged their leader not to go. They said, "Beowulf, no. You did plenty in defeating Grendel. You cannot survive jumping into that boiling mess and swimming in it to go get another monster." Well, Beowulf walked around the pool and he looked at the swamp and he said, "Well, I don't know. I might can make it." He said, "I'm going to take off this breastplate. It's going to weigh me down. I'll keep my helmet on, though. And I'll take Unferth's sword with me. I'll see how I can do." Well, his men again begged him not to go. Some had already fallen to their knees and started praying for him. And Beowulf said, "Wait for me here 3 days and 3 nights. I probably can't hold my breath any longer than that. And if I'm not back after 3 days and 3 nights, she probably got me. And you can go home and tell the king that I tried my best." And Beowulf looked at them and how sad they were. So to break the mood, he just laughed out loud before he plunged headlong into the old swamp. And down and down and down Beowulf went, the water getting darker and darker and darker. He shut his eyes because it was darker with them open. And then all of a sudden, as he went further and further and further down into that swamp, he could feel creatures biting him all over his body. Grindylows had come to attack him. But still, he did not waver. He kept kicking and swimming further and further and further down into the swamp. What Beowulf had not counted on was the pressure of the water. It was squeezing the life out of him. But then all of a sudden, he saw a greenish light and kicked his way hard toward it. It was at the bottom of the lake, the bottom of the swamp, and it was a cave with a greenish light coming out of it. The phosphorescent material in the cave was shining through, and Beowulf realized that must be the home of Grendel's mother. Beowulf looked at the cave entrance, and there was a membrane over the cave entrance. And as Beowulf put his hand through, the membrane seemed to close behind his hand and his arm, and he pushed the rest of his body through the membrane and it was closed behind him. And inside the cave was air. So Beowulf took great lungfuls of air, but he was so exhausted that he passed out on the floor of the cave. When Beowulf awoke, he had no idea how much time had passed. But his eyes began to adjust to the lights in the cave, and he saw great armaments everywhere, giant shields and giant swords, bones all over the floor where animals had been dragged down by Grendel and Grendel's mother. Even human bones were down there. And something that really amazed Beowulf, bones of giants that had once lived in the land. Grendel and Grendel's mother had even taken those races of people and killed them and dragged them down into their swamp long, long, long ago. But Beowulf, as a young warrior still, was just gawking at all of the richness that was there at the place. All of the shields and the swords, and he didn't notice that a tentacle had wrapped itself around his legs, inching further and further up his body until it got to his waist, started to tighten, and then he realized one of Grendel's mother's tentacles had reached out and grabbed him, and she had trapped him. He struggled to free himself, and he found he could not. Her grip just tightened on him, and he could hear her laughter. Her main body was in another cave, but he could hear her laughter, soft, malevolent, bloodthirsty. And she began to drag him into the heart of another cave, where the rest of her body was. Beowulf took out Unferth's sword and tried to hack at the tentacle, but her old skin was just too old and tough and scaly, and the blade bounced right off. Beowulf had to throw it to the ground because it wasn't doing him any good. And then as she dragged him further and further into the heart of her cave system, he looked up and saw a great giant sword that had been wielded obviously by a giant of long ago, a sword of great magical power. So Beowulf remembered his fight with Grendel. He remembered it was the goodness in his soul that truly had defeated Grendel, this source of evil, and she was even more evil than her son. So Beowulf took a great breath and let himself totally relax and let her drag him further into the cave. Well, she tugged on him to get him to respond. She needed his fear. It fed her, but he would not give that to her. And then when he passed that great sword, her grip had loosened just enough. He got out of it, jumped up on the wall, grabbed the great sword from the wall, and ran into the heart of the cave system where she was. And he saw this great bulk that was Grendel's mother. And Beowulf jumped up and plunged the great sword into this monster, killing Grendel's mother. Her body began to melt, as did the great heavy sword. And that really disappointed Beowulf, because Beowulf wanted a trophy. He wanted something he could take back. So Beowulf began to look around after Grendel's mother had melted, and he saw in an antechamber Grendel's body laid out. The torn out arm was there. Grendel's mother had tried to use her powers to reattach Grendel's arm, but it hadn't worked. So Beowulf ran back, got Unferth's sword, chopped off Grendel's head, and that's what he was going to hold and take back to King Hrothgar as a trophy. So Beowulf went back to the entrance of the cave where the membrane was. He took great lungfuls of air because he was going to have to hold his breath a long way. He buckled Unferth's sword. He grabbed Grendel's head, and he made his way through the membrane and kicked off and swam up to the surface. When he burst through the fiery scum at the pool's top, his men didn't know what to do. Some just dropped to their knees again and started praying thanks to God that he let Beowulf live. Others had enough presence of mind to help Beowulf from the swamp, and they got Grendel's head and they rolled it on the ground. Beowulf told them what had happened. They couldn't believe their great hero. And so Beowulf said, "Boys, I'm pretty tired. So take out your spears." So they all got their spears. He said, now stick the spears in at different angles in Grendel's head, and you all carry Grendel's head back for me. So they all stuck their spears in at Grendel. They hoisted the spears up on their shoulders, and between a whole bunch of them, they carried Grendel's head back to King Hrothgar. And King Hrothgar and Queen Wealhtheow could not believe what this young hero had done. The king ordered his men to start piling Beowulf's ship with treasure and with the finest horses from his stables. There were three or four times too many horses and too much gold than Beowulf's little ship could even carry. He had to leave 3/4 of it behind. They had another 3-day feast. The king presented Beowulf with a golden collar. It's a beautiful gold-wrought collar. Queen Wealhtheow said it had been made by the goddess Frigga. And it was the most perfectly constructed thing in the world, the Bringsman collar. Beowulf thanked them for that. He knew it was worth a fortune. And then also Queen Wealhtheow called Beowulf quietly over to her side and said, Beowulf, I have something I want to give you too. And she took off a ring from her finger. It only barely fit on Beowulf's little finger. She said, my mother gave me this, and it's very precious to me. She said, but just as a personal token of my appreciation for what you have done for our people, I want to give you this ring, so you'll always remember us. He said, well, ma'am, thank you very much. He knew it meant a lot to her to do that. Beowulf got ready to go, and the king and queen called him over. Said, Beowulf, we have another proposition for you. We have no children. God hasn't blessed us like that. We would like to adopt you and let you be our heir. Now that was a tremendous gift that these people were going to give to Beowulf. And Beowulf paused and politely thought it over, but then gradually shook his head no. He said, I appreciate it and I understand the gesture, and it's a magnificent gift that you're offering me, but I'm homesick. He said, I want to get back to my uncle and to my friends and the people I know. So they thanked him, and Beowulf and his men got aboard their little ship, now full of gold and horses, and they set sail again for the land of the Geats. King Hrothgar was so proud of his nephew. Beowulf told them what he had done. The warriors all gathered around, listened to Beowulf's stories. The king was so proud of his nephew. And he divided up the gold and gave it to his own warriors who had volunteered to go with him. He didn't keep any of it. While Beowulf had been gone, the king had married a pretty young girl who became queen. And Beowulf, as a wedding present, took off that beautiful Bringsman collar and put it around the neck of Queen Hyd and said, this is for you, my new aunt. And she thanked him, and the king loved his nephew's courtesy. And Beowulf took all the horses the king had given him, the finest horses from King Hrothgar's stables, and he said, these horses are for you, my king. And the king, again, was impressed by his nephew's generosity. He said, Beowulf, tell you what, what's the best horse that you brought back? And Beowulf said, well, I've had my eye on one. I know it's fit for a king. And he showed him this beautiful horse. And the king said, that's your horse. Tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up, get on that horse and start riding across the kingdom. However much land you cover, that is your new estate. And so that next morning, Beowulf got on that fast horse and he rode as hard as he could until sundown. And by sundown, Beowulf was master of a greater estate than anybody in the land except for the king himself. The only gift that Beowulf kept was that gold ring Queen Wealhtheow had put on his finger. He just couldn't bear to part with that. And so Beowulf became the heir to the throne until the king and queen had a little boy. But eventually the king died. And the nobles wanted Beowulf to be king, but he said, no, not while the king has a more proper heir. I will support little baby Hardred as the next king. And that will start our next video.